Hello, this is our point counterpoint presentation on food sensitivity testing. Today we'll be providing an arguments both for and against food sensitivity tests.
So first, what is a food sensitivity test? RD Rachel Ajmera explains that food sensitivity tests are meant to check how a person's immune system responds to different types of foods through the use of a sample. These samples could include hair, breath, blood, or saliva. And most of the time, these samples are taken and then mailed to a lab somewhere else. And then within a few days or weeks, you'll get online results. You can purchase these tests online through Everlywell or Amazon. You could also get them at places in person like Walmart, Walgreens, or CVS. If you're lucky, you can get one on sale for around $30. If it's not on sale, it could cost anywhere from $80 to $300. So because a lot of people seem to use these terms interchangeably, I went ahead and made a chart to describe the differences between food sensitivities, food allergies, and food intolerances. Food sensitivities are not life-threatening, and they are an immune response to a specific food or group of foods. The symptoms that you could experience with a food sensitivity would be digestive distress, joint pain, brain fog, migraines, and then these symptoms may be subtle or won't happen right away. Food allergies can be severe. They can even be life-threatening. They're also an immune response to a food, but they're caused by an increased production of IgE, which is immunoglobulin E. They could have symptoms such as hives, tongue swelling, difficulty breathing, difficulty swallowing, and dizziness, and then they'll occur within a 2-hour period within eating a food. Food intolerances are not life-threatening, and they are when the body lacks specific enzymes needed to break down a specific food. These include symptoms such as upset stomach or other digestive problems. So some commonly reported food sensitivities include the foods on this chart, but they also include things such as gluten, which can be found in grains like pasta, bread, and baked goods, but also in some condiments and other random foods. Lactose, which is in dairy, milk, cheeses, butter. Then caffeine, that's a big one. That's one I've heard from a lot of people, from coffees, teas, soda, energy drinks, chocolate, things like that. Then salicylates, which are found in some fruits and veggies, also tea, coffee, spices, honey, and nuts. Histamine, which is the most common trigger within people, which is found in fermented foods, cured meats, dried fruit, citrus fruit, and avocados. Then monosodium glutamate, or MSG, which is found in ripened fruits, cured meat, and certain savory food. And lastly, we have sulfites, which are in ciders, beers, and wines.
And then in terms of social media for food sensitivity tests, I was expecting it to all just be like trends like for food sensitivity tests, but it's actually pretty split in either direction. So there's pro food sensitivity tests, posts even by like Everywell, which is the company that makes them, and there's tests against saying that they just kind of represent the foods that you've eaten. So bottom line is don't use social media as a resource for your health information. And then I wanted to give some background on FODMAP diets, which are kind of used to treat some of the same or like overlapping symptoms which are found in IBS. So some of the like gassiness, abdominal pain, in general, like GI upset symptoms that are like functionally are used to functionally define IBS. So a FODMAP diet are often the first line of treatment for IBS. They kind of started to come into play in the early 2000s, or that's when the research got started on them. And they involve a pretty intensive elimination diet of high FODMAP foods. So foods that contain various carbohydrates that are related to those IBS symptoms of bloating, gassiness, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and constipation. And they involve eliminating the foods for 6 to 8 weeks, followed by a slow reintroduction of one food every 3 to 4 days. So it's a pretty intensive process and one that should be guided by an RD. And then this is just a chart of like all the foods that contain maps so that like initial elimination diet would be very intensive if we were just relying on the FODMAP diet for kind of treating some of these generalized GI symptoms that we don't have other specific causes for. And then what is the significance of this topic? On my end of the presentation, I definitely talk, I'm advocating for food sensitivity tests, and I talk about the prevalence of IBS. So IBS affects 10 to 20% of the US population and decreases quality of life, workplace productivity, and is idiopathic / functionally defined. So we don't really know much about what causes it, and it's kind of defined by its symptoms. And then food sensitivity tests can be misleading and expensive without like good consumer knowledge about using them. Many people are buying these at-home tests and instead of going to their health professionals for more accurate information about their health. And then how is this connected to public health nutrition? So pretty much, it's really important to have access to dietitians along with education specifically for these type of elimination diets. So usually with food sensitivity tests, the foods that they identify are going to then be used to create an elimination diet similar to that FODMAP elimination diet. This should always be done under the guidance of an RD. And according to Lomer, there often aren't enough RDs to administer this education. So that could be a point of public health intervention. Food sensitivity tests should not be used like instead of basic nutrition guidelines or healthcare visits. So that's like a public health concern that these would be replacing that basic preventative healthcare. And then nutrition information may be addressed by public health professionals through PSE recommendations and other effective education intervention methods, or and also for referring people to the right healthcare professionals.
So our thesis statement, to sum up what we're going to be going over in the presentation, is that food sensitivity tests using IgG antibodies could be a tool to narrow the scope of elimination diets used for IBS, but the research that is continuing to be improved. However, research that is available right now shows that the tests aren't cost-effective and often inaccurate, which can lead to consequences such as false diagnosis or disordered eating, just to name a few. So for an overview of our presentation, Carter is going to go over the supporting popular sources and science-based resources that, again, support food sensitivity tests, and then he's going to explain some PSE recommendations that he came up with. I'm going to do the same exact thing, but against food sensitivity tests. Then we're going to rebut our argument and then come to a conclusion together. So for food sensitivity tests,
so I'll be presenting 4 food sensitivity tests. I wanted to start off with the most popular version of a food sensitivity test, which are created by Everywell. Everywell is a clinical testing company that also provides telehealth platforms for the tests that it provides. So these tests could be anything from COVID-19 to food sensitivity testing. And then they market their food sensitivity tests to identifying foods that, quote, may be causing discomfort. And these symptoms could include headache, abdominal pain, bloating, and indigestion. They use IgG antibody testing to identify foods that clients may have sensitivities to. And they may be useful because immune reactions to these foods might be delayed. So you might not eat the food right away and feel the symptom right away, and making it harder to identify what is causing the discomfort. And then a cool thing about this website is that they also provide that telehealth as well as follow-up guidance about elimination diets. So they're not just giving people a list of food and telling them to cut it out completely. They are providing guidance and support along the way. And then this is Mosaic Diagnostics. They're kind of like the more expensive and more cutting edge version of these food sensitivity testing companies. So their registered dietitian on staff, Lindsay Goddard, says that they are an easier alternative to elimination diets. Their website describes the mechanism. So the mechanism of this IgG testing as so when the food is introduced, there is overproduction of IgG antibodies, which are not cleared, effectively causing inflammation. This website also gets into clarifying that the testing is for not only for IgG4, but also for IgG1 through 3. So it's commonly cited that IgG4 is kind of like it's only reactive to the foods that you've recently eaten. So it's not really showing your sensitivity to food, but it's showing your reaction to the food that you've recently eaten in the lab test. But this website goes on to clarify that they're also testing for IgG1 through 3. Therefore, they might have be able to show different results with those tests. The other thing that's cool about this website or about this company is that they also use a variety of other methods and test for other compounds within the blood work to identify sensitivities. And they're kind of like representative of that. The research is ongoing. So they're like continuously coming out with new methodology for these food sensitivity tests. And then one more thing on this slide, this is their CLIA certification, so they are an accredited lab. So just to lend a little bit of credibility to them as a company, and then this is also a testimonial from their registered dietitian on staff, Lindsay Goddard. And then kind of the key points, I really went into the research on this IgG testing in relationship to IBS. So these tests, none of the test websites like Everywell, they don't claim to treat IBS, but there is an overlap in these sort of idiopathic symptoms that are part of IBS and also often part of what might be treated for these food sensitivity tests. And then, so pretty much IBS is functionally defined and idiopathic with many potential causes, including inflammation. FODMAP diets are not effective in all IBS patients and can be intensive or might require registered dietitian supervision. And then again, the IG4 is shown to be connected to foods eaten, but food sensitivity tests may measure for multiple forms of IgG. And then research is ongoing. So there's like, ongoing value to continuing to invest in this in this IgG research, which might be useful for helping IBS patients who aren't seeing resolution to these symptoms through other treatment methods. And then this is one of the studies about the actual like effectiveness of the IgG testing in a clinical study. So pretty much it found that using elimination rotation diets that were guided by the food sensitivity testing, so they would identify a list of foods and then do an elimination diet, were more effective in treating mixed IBS symptoms than as well as extraintestinal symptoms. So that could include that like tiredness, skin conditions and headaches, so some of those more generalized symptoms that the food sensitivity tests are trying to identify. So pretty much it found that this was actually more effective to do this food sensitivity test and elimination rotation diet than the FODMAP diet or other traditional diets for treating IBS. And it was a clinically controlled study. So pretty much, and it also went over this concept that the IgG testing and the elimination rotation diets are useful because the IgG testing shows delayed reactions or delayed food hypersensitivities. And this is another study. This is kind of like the starting point for some of this research on the food sensitivity testing. So I will note that this is back in 2004, but pretty much it was a controlled trial that showed that pretty much they took 8 foods that were identified by the food sensitivity test and 8 totally random foods, eliminated them from people's diets, and they found a 10% higher rate in reduction of IBS symptoms among these clinical trial participants who had IBS when they eliminated the 8 foods that were identified via the food sensitivity test. And then in terms of PSE recommendations, in terms of federal policy, I would recommend for allocation of federal funding for continued research on IgG food sensitivity testing, and also so they can work towards FDA approval so that this is something that can be offered through insurance and also can be administered by healthcare providers to be a more useful tool in helping treat some of these more generalized symptoms. And then on Um, oh, okay. And then in terms of like system, so pretty much implementing the telehealth. So pretty much in terms of a systems approach, this would be like at a primary care office level. So you would want to implement telehealth or in-person counseling for managing IBS, which involves counseling on the 5-MOP diets and the food sensitivity tests in a controlled environment, and help guide these elimination diets in a way that is safe and effective. This program could also be implemented as a study on food sensitivity testing. So again, this would meet that need of providing more in-depth counseling along with these diets that are meant to treat some of these generalized GI symptoms, and can also serve as a way to further the research on this subject. And then in terms of like environment changes, so I would want to see educational posters in primary care offices about the correct usage of food sensitivity tests, and also advertising the programs above of the counseling services to use them in a more controlled environment, with the support of a registered dietitian. And then organizations that may support further research, intervention, and education would include the American College of Gastroenterology. So in an article by the New York Times, which is noted here, Callahan 2022, they note a quote from the American College of Gastroenterology where they're saying, pretty much, this is interesting. We'd like to see more research. So hopefully the American College of Gastroenterology would be a great place to start in terms of funding more research on food sensitivity testing.
So now I'm going to talk about the against side of food sensitivity tests. I chose Healthline because whenever I look up something online, health related, Healthline is the first thing that pops up. It's giving information, and I guarantee that's what a lot of other people are going to when they look up a question online. So first, research from PubMed that is referenced in this article leads to Healthline stating that some tests measure levels of antibodies in the blood. So the research states the presence of these antibodies may not be an accurate marker of food sensitivity, as many other antibodies and cell-mediated reactions may also be involved in the causation of a food sensitivity. So the Healthline also said that some tests mention using genetic background to help determine results, but research surrounding genetic testing and food sensitivities is limited. This claim was supported by another article published in PubMed to support this claim. Healthline also said that many studies that support these tests are often only referenced by the companies that sell the tests, are often outdated, or have been published in a non-reputable journal. Notice there is no citation here because that is just a Healthline claim, so we aren't sure how accurate that is, but it is a claim that Healthline did make. They also mentioned that the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, or AAAAI, has advised against using these tests to diagnose food sensitivities. They list a few concerns raised by the author that don't reference any sources, such as unnecessary elimination of foods from the diet, inadequate intake of important nutrients, and then the development of worsening disordered eating behaviors. So Healthline's overall conclusion is that there is limited evidence to support the at-home food service sensitivity test. Therefore, Healthline does not recommend for people to purchase and use the test. The second popular resource that I used was Medical News Daily, because they pop up almost every time that Healthline does. And because it says medical news, it seems to be more reputable for people. So they also are against food sensitivity tests. They said that these tests claim, they literally used the quotations in the article, to help someone learn what foods might cause uncomfortable digestive symptoms. They continue to say that there isn't scientific evidence that suggests these tests have any clinical value. No, there is no research article listed here. This is just Medical News Daily. They also explain that they don't replace a diagnosis or treatment from healthcare professionals, including doctors or dietitians. Again, no resource used. These scientific studies claiming their effectiveness are often older or published in non-reputable journals. They did use AAAAI as a reference to state that, just like Healthline did. And then they even stated that AAAAI suggests that these antibodies being raised in the body are likely a normal immune response to food exposure. They also said that the presence of antibodies doesn't reliably identify food triggers for any food-induced condition. Again, they used AAAAI as a reference to state that. This is what most tests are testing for. And then finally, they use the Australian Society of Immunology and Allergy as a source to state that research suggests that some of the tests that rely on genetic testing aren't accurate for diagnostic purposes. So it is important to note that this is from an Australian source, so we don't know how accurate it is to translate over here in the US because they may be using different tests to state those claims. Medical News Daily also discussed some possible consequences that could come from the results of an inaccurate at-home test. These consequences included health anxiety, unnecessary dietary changes, unnecessary restrictions, and malnutrition from a result of both of those, which just means missing out on some key nutrients. They also said these tests could contribute to disordered eating practices. And then a new consequence that they listed that was different from Healthline was the self-diagnosis that may lead to missing out on an actual clinical diagnosis such as IBS or Crohn's disease that may be causing the GI symptoms. When we look at the actual research, we see that these tests look for antibody in blood or saliva, which indicates a reaction to food, specifically IgG. So the presence of IgG doesn't necessarily mean there's an intolerance. It could just mean that a food was eaten recently. That is said because IgG can remain in the body for up to 9 months after being exposed to food. So recently is not exactly a great term to use because it's not scientifically sound. It's not easy to distinguish if the IgG levels are heightened because something was just eaten or if it's because there's a response. This particular article says that the tests are expensive and may produce inaccurate results. They recommend consulting with a health professional or trying an elimination diet to figure out food sensitivities. I also decided to see what the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics says about this topic. They ultimately said that tests are not an official medical diagnosis, and the evidence supporting the tests is questionable as of now. They also said for food allergy testing, blood tests are used to measure IgE antibodies to indicate an immune system response. I thought this statement was important to include because it really shows the difference between IgE and IgG, which if you're listening to this presentation, you may have not noticed the difference between the two being used, but there is a difference. These tests typically look for IgG, which is not an indicator of an immune system response. Again, just like the research article said in the last slide, IgG has not been shown to reliably identify food allergies or sensitivities. Most people produce these antibodies after simply eating foods. That being said, past or frequent exposure to food may cause these levels to be higher. They also said that making changes after seeing the results is not supported because the results could lead to unnecessarily avoiding healthy foods. And then something I found interesting that wasn't said anywhere else was that it could prompt individuals with food allergies to include foods that could be harmful to them. Lastly, A&D said that insurance will not cover the cost of these tests due to them not being backed by science. So what are my recommendations for against the tests? At the federal level, I would say get these off of the shelves and keep them out of the general public's hands. I think it would be smart to get these off of the shelves because there's a lot of consequences that can come from false results from the tests. At the local level, if the tests were still to be used somewhere, I think it could be appropriate in a public school setting. Like if a kid reacts to something in the cafeteria at school, food sensitivity tests could be used to determine what is causing that reaction at school and could help refer parents to see a health professional to get a real diagnosis. This would be an appropriate use for the test. It would only be in the hands of health professionals. However, I do think that these tests are pretty expensive, so they may not be the best fit for every school. At the state level, a policy could be written that allows people to have more access to seeing a health professional for food, allergies, sensitivities, or intolerances. The justification for implementing more accessibility is so that people would be more likely to get real tests done by allergy professionals and could hopefully have some of the costs paid for by their insurance. I believe that AAAAI, or Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, or AAFA, may be interested in supporting one of these interventions, especially because both of them had very, very strong stances against the test. I also think that the local doctor's offices may be willing to support these interventions.
Right. And then my rebuttal, I did also want to include, it's not on this slide, but I did want to include that IgG is, it's a type of antibody, so it is related to the immune system. It is immune response. It's just different from IgE, which is the what we look for in allergies. So pretty much most food sensitivity tests, including the Everywell food sensitivity test, they don't claim to diagnose or test for food allergies or food intolerances. And then the references for AAAI and AAFA are related more to allergies, which I do acknowledge that, which is related to the immune system, which IgG is part of the immune system. But a lot of the symptoms that we're really looking for in these food sensitivity tests or foods that related to those symptoms do also fall under the GI system. So I just wanted to note that like organizations that are looking into GI symptoms, such as the symptoms that are related to IBS or have crossover between IBS symptoms, would also be good organizations that may be invested in this. And then in terms of claims that IgG testing just finds out what someone ate, they're often based on IgG4, while food sensitivity tests do measure a greater range, so IgG 1 through 4. And then research is ongoing and shouldn't be dismissed for treatment of idiopathic symptoms, including those that cross over with IBS. And then I do agree that we need more public health education and access to registered dietitians while administering these tests, as well as elimination diets, and that we should have more dietitians in general who are available to address these problems. And then I did also have a rebuttal specifically towards using these in schools. So I think kind of going along the basic guidelines of don't yuck my yum, like children shouldn't be really introduced to any restrictive diets unless absolutely medically necessary, so because they're still establishing their healthy relationships to food. I think because of the risk with any sort of elimination diet of increasing eating disorder behaviors, especially in middle school and high school, I don't think these would be a good idea. And then in public schools, I don't think like one public school nurse would be enough to administer these to the student body. And I said, maybe if there was like a high school clinic on staff that had a larger and more diverse clinical staff, that could be helpful. But I also don't think that many schools would have an RD available to kind of do the follow-up necessary to utilize the results from these tests. And then also, young children have changing allergies, so they can grow out of allergies. And the American Academy of Pediatrics does currently recommend that they're exposed to allergen foods. So trying to restrict these foods at an early age could get confusing or contradict recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And of course, that's also like, unless the doctor recommends to avoid an allergen. Like if a close family member has a severe peanut allergy, they might give different guidance. And then I also just wanted to mention like the practicality of trying to do some of these methods of collection. Like most of the food sensitivity tests that I looked at are completed using a finger prick. So it could be really hard, especially with little kids, to do a finger prick test in a school setting, as well as to get consent from parents to do that. And then I also said, you know, with tight public school budgets, how would the cost of these tests be justified?
So those were some really great points, but I am going to rebuttal still to support the against side of the food sensitivity test, starting with depending on which test you take, food-specific IgG and our IgE levels will be measured to a wide array of foods. And this was actually from an article that was used on the 4-sided food sensitivity test earlier in the article, or in the presentation, sorry. So this article was found on PubMed, which is, however, saying, sorry. This article was found on PubMed. So it is definitely a good source to look at, and it does cover bases on both sides of the argument. However, the only time that IgG was mentioned was to explain that it is not an accurate way to measure sensitivities. Although it may be a good indicator of sensitivity, many people produce high levels of this antibody after just eating foods and can still have elevated amounts of IgG for up to 9 months after a person is exposed to food. Therefore, it's been deemed as inaccurate as it's hard to distinguish the difference between just ate a food and being sensitive to a food. Also, research presented as published in PubMed and backed by reputable academies such as A&D or AAAAI. The I in AAAAI is for immunology, which is the study of the immune system. The definition of a food sensitivity is the immune response to a specific food or group of foods. That being said, AAAAI is definitely relevant when talking about food sensitivities. It's also important to note that food sensitivity tests are not just marketed as IBS symptom identifiers, but as tests used to find foods people are sensitive to that cause symptoms similar to IBS or symptoms such as migraines, joint pain, brain fog, and many more. Food sensitivity tests should not be used for treatment of any health issue as they are not backed by enough updated research. Again, unnecessarily restricting foods after the result of a test with false results can lead to disordered eating, misdiagnosis leading to untreated IBS, malnutrition, or health anxiety. I also want to note that AAFA was only used in PSE recommendations as an organization that may be interested in implementing policy changes in the future. AAFA is relevant as allergies, intolerances, and sensitivities are often confused by the public. Their website provides a ton of information about sensitivities and why you should not buy the at-home test, as they believe they are marketed to uneducated individuals who don't know the difference between the three. I believe they would be on board with the movement to get the tests off the shelves and make clinical testing more accessible to the public. As for the rebuttal that was against getting these tests in public schools, I do want to clarify that they would not be a diagnosis or automatic restriction of foods at school. They would act as a first step if a child is constantly coming in after lunch with symptoms such as digestive pain, migraines, joint pain, or brain fog. For example, a child comes in every Tuesday after eating corn tortilla tacos at lunch. A test could be administered, and if it comes back positive for, let's say, the corn tortillas, then the school could send something to the parents about the results and refer them to another health professional to see if they have a sensitivity, intolerance, or allergy to corn. Also, the test would only be administered on an as-needed basis. They would not be meant to serve the entire school population. Once again, if a student repeatedly comes in after eating, there may be a reason to test. Otherwise, these tests are not needed for every student. Similar to how Band-Aids aren't given to every student who goes to school. They are given on an as-needed basis if someone has a scrape or fell or something similar to that. Also, I believe that school nurses are fully capable of administering the tests when they're needed. The argument that nurses should not be giving the tests because they lack certification is a good point against the use of the tests, and serves as a very great point to say that nobody should be using the at-home tests. However, as this is a recommendation for where I think the tests could be useful if I had to find a place for them in society, I will say that a nutrition background is not needed to swab a child's mouth or do a finger prick. Finger pricking is not the only method of collecting samples. So if they don't want their finger pricked, they could just do a quick mouth swab. Nurses are fully capable and certified to swab mouths and finger prick, as well as know the symptoms of the body after eating something that the immune system rejects. Lastly, addressing the cost concern, occasionally companies will pay schools to administer the products. I think this would be the best case scenario for administering the tests at schools. And this has been done a lot in schools. Like recently, Canvas has paid schools to use its program for classes instead of other platforms such as Google Classroom. This also happens a lot with school sports teams being sponsored by Nike or Adidas, and then vending machines being sponsored by Pepsi or Coke. Other than that, the only other option would be a grant to sponsor the tests, such as the public health department in the area sends each school 5 of these tests a year or something similar like that. So overall, we both came to the agreement that we both agreed that accessibility to healthcare and treatment for generalized symptoms should be increased. Current research leans towards the dismissal of the test for any use by the public.
No. However, new research is being done that could provide insight on how these tests may help people who experience IBS symptoms. Overall, more research is needed.